Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Grain Farmers of Ontario GrainTALK Webinar. This webinar today examines the success stories of the 2023 cereal crop, what can be done looking towards the 2024 crop, and also will include some highlights from the 2023 Great Lakes Yield Enhancement Network. Today on the webinar, we have myself, Laura Ferrier, and Marty Vermey, both with Grain Farmers of Ontario, and joining us is Joanna Fallings. Joanna is the cereals specialist with OMAFRA, based out of Stratford. She is passionate about supporting Ontario growers with their cereal crop production challenges and opportunities. She is part of the Great Lakes YEN team in Ontario, which is one of a global series of YENs that help local farmers better understand their winter wheat potential and learn what is limiting that potential. Thank you so much, Joanna, for taking the time to present to us, and we can't wait to hear what you have to share with us.
Great, thank you, Laura. Marty, really happy to be here today to talk about my favorite crop, the winter wheat crop. There's a lot of buzz in the air, especially after what we experienced in 2023. We had an awesome planting in the fall of 2022. Winter wheat went into ideal conditions, and we really had maximum or optimized our yield potential going into the 2023 season. Yields were much better than anticipated. We had some struggles in the spring with some challenging cool, wet conditions. But fortunately, thanks to a wheat crop that had a really great start, our yields in Ontario were excellent again this year. We're averaging well above the provincial average, with looking at about 98 bushels per acre for our soft red winter wheat crop, which is the highest we've had in Ontario thus far. So we had a really, really great crop coming out of a bit of a challenging year. And so I really wanted to focus in on some of the things that I thought we did really well in Ontario. And a lot of that really starts with how we started up our crop in the fall of 2022. I know many of you producers in Ontario or growers in Ontario have seen this planting date map. This is the optimum planting date map for Ontario. And we get lots of questions around this map. We've got new varieties that have come to the market. We've got a bit of a change in climate. And so there's always lots of questions around, is this planting date map still accurate? Is this something we should be following? And so I'm going to touch on some of that today. And the answer is yes, this map is still quite accurate. We can be very confident in the planting date ranges that are recommended for winter wheat in Ontario. But again, this year, it's a bit of a challenge. We had a cooler season. Soybeans are a little bit later to be coming off. And so we're going to touch on some of the things that, although we have a later planting date this year, that we can do to still optimize and maximize our yield potential. So when this map was first developed with planting date trials across the province, thanks to Dr. Andy Bootsma at the Agriculture Agri-Food Canada, they've determined, for every day we delay planting, we lose about 1.1 bushels per acre. And so we wanted to dive into that a little bit further. As I mentioned, questions around, was it still accurate? And so Dr. Dave Hooker and Dr. Josh Nzalski at the University of Guelph, along with their graduate student, Emma Dillman, decided to dive into this work and investigate some of these things. And so trials were set up at Ridgetown and Exeter in 2020, fall of 2020 and the fall of 2021. And they were actually planted again in the fall of 2022 with some adjustments. Across those two locations, we looked at two different management strategies, a standard management strategy, which most growers are using today, 120 pounds of nitrogen, some sulfur, a T3 fungicide application, compared that to intensive management system, which would have had three-way split nitrogen, about 150 pounds of nitrogen total with some sulfur, along with two fungicides at a flag leaf, as well as at T3 timing for fusarium head blight. And then we also threw in a plant growth regulator with those higher nitrogen rates. And so what was really interesting from that work is that the yield trends in this study were very similar to what we were seeing in the previous work done by Dr. Andy Bootsma that went into developing that planting date map. And so we didn't see significant yield differences between intensive and standard management, but we did see significant differences between planting date. So our ideal planting date in Exeter is September 30th and October 10th in Ridgetown, just to give you a bit of an idea of what dates we're looking at. So in this study, an early planting date would have been around September 18th to September 30th. And in that, we found that we were getting 100% yield potential with those early planting dates. The mid-early planting date, which would have been about 1 week or so later, 1 to 2 weeks later, or ideal timing compared to our optimum planting dates in that map. Our mid-late would be about October 14th to November 8th. So it's about 2 to 3 weeks later from our optimum planting date. And then our late planting date there was late October and actually into December for Ridgetown. So it was about 4 to 5 weeks later than our optimum planting date. And what was interesting is that, yes, we had optimum, or at our optimum planting date, we had 100% potential, but even at 1 to 2 weeks later, we were still getting 95 to 100% our yield potential. So, as long as we're well within that range, we're getting 100% of our yield potential. As we got into mid-October and into early November, so 2 to 3 weeks after our optimum planting dates, we were losing about 15 to 25% of our yield. So we were getting upwards to maximum of 85% of our yield potential. So still really good potential at that date. But once we got into that really late planting date, that's where we really started to see a significant decline. And that's where we would get to about 65 to 89% of our yield potential. So what this just really highlights is that, yes, we have those optimum planting dates, but even if we are pushing, a couple weeks later, we still have very good yield potential in Ontario. But again, that will depend on the type of fall we get and the type of weather conditions we get. Because we're not able to predict the weather more often than not, we want to be still targeting those earlier or optimum planting dates. And so the question arises, well, what is it about early planting dates that contributes to high yields? So why do we see higher yields at those earlier planting dates? And it all comes down to the number of heads per meter square. So with those early or mid-early planting dates, we were seeing much, much higher heads per meter squared, greater than 700 to 800 heads per meter square. Whereas in those earlier planting dates, we were much lower than that. What was contributing to the high yield in these planting date trials was the heads per meter square. So in the earlier planting dates, we were seeing upwards of 900 heads per meter square, whereas in the later planting dates, we were seeing much lower than that. So early planting results in the highest number of heads per meter square. What was very interesting was that we saw a lot of variation in the kernels per head and the kernel weight. And so that demonstrated to us that this is highly environment or weather dependent. So what we can control, though, is the number of heads per meter square, and we can do that with planting date. In this research, we also found that the biomass accumulation, which was much higher in the earlier planting dates across all site years compared to the later planting dates. And why this is so important is because this really plays into our canopy closure and the number of the amount of solar radiation that a crop is able to then capture and utilize. So in this work, Emma was able to dive into some of the canopy closure and biomass data and found that with earlier planting dates, we are having an 80 to 90% solar radiation capture at flagleaf. So much, much earlier in the growing season. Whereas in the later planted plots, we actually didn't maximize our solar radiation capture to almost physiological maturity. So it was much, much later in the growing season. So we really weren't optimizing the resources available to us. So again, with those early planting dates, we're able to increase the number of heads per meter square or optimize that. And then we are also able to optimize the biomass accumulation, have that canopy closure much earlier in the season, resulting in optimum solar radiation capture much, much earlier on. And so what's really interesting with this is we took a look at some of the yield data some of the data from the Great Lakes Yen and very, very similar trends. We've got a number of growers in there across the region and very similar results. The highest yielding producers also had the highest biomass. They also tended to have a high number of grains per meter square. And again, very similar to what we were seeing in this study, much higher number of heads per meter square in those producers that were the highest yielding. So the top 20% of producers had the highest number of heads per meter square. And again, the highest amount of biomass. So this is where planting date, and when you hear us talk so much about the importance of planting date, this is the reasoning behind that. But again, this year, it's quite challenging because we have a later planted or a later maturing soybean crop. And so we're doing our best to get our wheat in the ground, but we can't always do that in every instance. So we're going to touch a little bit about some of the things we can do to help speed up that planting date. And so a part of what Emma did in this study was to look at, can we speed up the harvest maturity of our soybean crop? And so she looked at 3 different herbicides to be applied at a couple different growth stages prior to harvest. So she looked at diaquat, saflufenicel, and borax at R6.5, applied at R6.5, R7, and R7.5. And what was really interesting is that she found that we could, in fact, advance our soybean maturity and our soybean harvest by up to 5 days in with the use of diaquat applied at R6.5. However, what was interesting in this work is that unfortunately, we did see a negative yield impact over the control. So where we didn't apply a herbicide, we did see a bit of a yield impact, and we also did see a bit of a yield impact on test weight. And so this is something that we want to continue to explore. I know there's lots of questions, especially this year, as we're trying to get those soybeans to mature a little faster. And so this is something that's going to require a bit more further investigation before we get to make fulsome recommendations. But I mentioned this here because perhaps as we continue to explore down this road, there might be some options in the future. And perhaps we can identify ways to have a reduced impact on the soybean yield as well as test weight. So again, I know there's lots of interest in this, but this is something we don't want to quite yet jump into until we do a bit more research to reduce the impact on the soybean crop. But there are some things that we can do, and I bring this up now because as we're in the field, we're seeing what's happening, we're seeing how the soybeans are maturing, we're seeing where we're able to get our wheat in the ground earlier. It's a really great time to make note of some of these differences in your fields. So here's an example of a field. It's the exact same variety. The only difference here is a 2-week planting date difference. So unfortunately, the soybeans on the right due to some challenges in the spring with getting the crop planted. It was 2 weeks delayed planting, and as you can see, there's a pretty significant difference here in the maturity and the impact that that's going to have on your ability to get your wheat in the ground. So so for this year, make note of those fields or those varieties where you're seeing some of this. And when we're going out next spring to plant our soybeans, we want to be making sure that we're planting those soybean fields that we're intending for wheat that fall. So the earlier we can get those soybeans planted, it also makes a huge difference in getting those soybeans matured quicker and off the fields faster. Another piece we can consider, because again, this time of year, lots of conversations around soybean seed selection and purchasing seed. Again, look at those varieties in your fields intended for winter wheat that have a slightly shorter season and would allow you to get those soybeans off earlier. So if we're looking at a half a maturity group less, we're able to harvest that crop on average based on the Ontario Soybean Performance Trials at least 5 days earlier. Now there is a bit of a yield impact from that. We're looking at some upwards of 2 bushels per acre, and that will depend on the area that you're in. So you are going to have to look at some local data. Now, if we go to a whole maturity group less, we're actually able to get our soybeans off an extra 9 days earlier. So but again, a yield impact of 4 bushels per acre on our soybeans. So again, there is some math there. I did some quick numbers this morning with $18 soybeans, $7 beans, and it's about break even because we're able to plant our wheat 5 days earlier, which is 5.5 bushels more. And with wheat at a whole maturity group less, we're able to get an extra 9.9 bushels with our wheat crop. So again, you're going to have to do the economics on your farm, but generally speaking, that's sort of how that pencils out. And again, this doesn't need to be all your soybean acres, but just those where you're planning or intending to put in wheat next year. Target those fields for that. So We've got a bit of a later planting date this fall. Soybeans are coming off this weekend. We've got edible beans coming off. There's already wheat in the ground, which is excellent. We're looking at September 25th. And I'm still very hopeful this fall that we're going to have a great window of opportunity for winter wheat. And the reason for that is because of the weather outlook and the growing degree day outlook. So it's always important to remember that it takes 80 growing degree days for the seed to germinate. And again, to calculate growing degree days, it's your maximum and minimum daily temperatures added together divided by 2. And that's the number of growing degree days you get for that day. So once we hit 80 growing degree days, your seed will germinate. And then for every 50 or for every inch of seeding depth, it takes another 50 growing degree days. So it takes about 130 growing degree days for that seed to emerge from a 1-inch seeding depth. As we go deeper, it's going to take a little more. If you're a little shallower, it's going to take a little less. And so you can see here, the blue bars are the previous 2 weeks from today. So we're at about a range of 230 to 270 across the province in terms of our growing degree accumulations. But looking at the next 14 days, we have an excellent forecast. We've got very warm temperatures well into October, and you can see in the green bars there, we're actually in the south, for example, we're much higher than the previous 2 weeks for our accumulations, but we're about the same. So this is very excellent, and you can see that we're well above in the next 2 weeks. We've got lots of opportunity for that seed to germinate and add leaves to that plant. So again, the fall outlook is very good as we push into later seeding dates here. With later planting dates, we can also do things to reduce that yield hit, and part of that is with seeding rates. So in that trial, we were using the same seeding rate across treatments to try to look at specifically planting date, but we know that by increasing our seeding rates by 200,000 seeds per acre for every week that we're delayed, we can reduce that yield impact because we're going to have more main heads, more main stems there because we anticipate having less tillering. Generally speaking, early seeding dates, we want to start out that 1.4 seeding rate. As we tend to push later, we should be starting at that 1.5, 1.6 million seeds per acre as we push into later planting dates. And this is particularly important on heavy clay soils, areas where we maybe have some poor seed bed management there. And if you're broadcast seeding, if we're broadcast seeding, we should be upwards of 2.5 million seeds per acre. But again, broadcast seeding is sort of a, we want to be drilling our wheat in first. If we're able to drill in our wheat, that's what we want to be doing. Broadcast seeding is sort of that backup plan in those situations where we're not able to drill in our wheat at the optimum time as we would like to proceed. So generally speaking, we want to drill in our wheat and avoid some broadcast seeding if we are able to do that. Very similar into the yen, we were seeding for those growers in the top 20%. They were seeding approximately Julian calendar date is about September the 26th. So they're planting most of the time targeting September planting date. And some of our later or lower yielding producers were pushing into early October. So that 280 is October the 7th. So we were on average about 11 days earlier with our higher yielding producers compared to the lower yielding producers. And some very similar trend with seeding rates. We tended to start at 1.4, 1.5 million seeds per acre in those September planting dates and upping those by 200,000 seeds per week, as you can see here. Excuse me. One thing though I want to mention with this planting date piece though, is we always want to make sure we are planting into ideal conditions. We want to make sure we have a nice, that we are closing that seed trench, that we're not mudding it in. So planting conditions always trump planting date. So if we get into some wet conditions, if we've got some rainfall today or tomorrow, it's important to wait a few days for the conditions to be ideal for planting wheat. Don't try to mud it in. If we mud it in, that's where we get issues again. No seed trench closing. We might not have good root development and run into issues like lodging, heaving, and those sorts of things come springtime. We also could run into some issues with winter kill if that seed trench isn't closed properly. So again, ensure that our planting conditions are ideal over our planting date. So if you're a few days later, you're better off to wait than trying to mud that wheat in. The other thing that we can do, and that's particularly helpful if we get a tough winter, is ensuring that we are maximizing or optimizing our fall fertility. We know starter, particularly phosphorus in particular, provides nutrients for early growth and promotes root development. And this is particularly important as we get into later planting dates. It improves winter survival, and it also creates more crop uniformity. And this can be extremely important in the springtime or in June when we're trying to make our T3 fungicide applications. If we don't have a nice uniform crop, it can be very challenging to time that T3 application. Although we do have crop protection products now that have a much wider window, that P starter really helps keep that crop nice and uniform all the way through to maturity. So it's definitely something that we don't want to overlook. We've got lots of very strong data on this in Ontario, where we've got low testing soils, high testing soils, medium testing soils. And we know that with MAP or phosphorus, again, in particular, we're seeing a significant benefit over no starter treatment. So in a low testing soils here, over 21 site years, we had an average of 5 bushel response with phosphorus versus no phosphorus. And what's very interesting is that even on extremely high testing soils, so we have a P value above 20, we were still seeing a 3 bushel per acre response to that P starter. And so that tells us that winter wheat is highly responsive to P in particular. I know there's lots of discussion around some other nutrients out there. Some folks like to put some potash down to help build the soil test, which is great, but ensuring that we have that phosphorus there is so important. Things like sulfur, we tend to need sulfur more so in the spring. And if we're putting down things like elemental sulfur in the fall, it's very difficult to determine in time when that sulfur is going to become available in the spring. So if we can, we really want to be making those sulfur applications in the spring when the crop demand is the most high. So in the fall, we really want to be focusing on our phosphorus starter. Again, particularly important as we get into later planting dates to just help get that crop off to a great start right out of the gate. Another piece that we can often overlook in the fall because we are busy, we're trying to get our soybeans harvested, our edible beans harvested, corn harvested, wheat planted. We can also have some challenges with temperatures, and that is fall weed control. But the reason I bring this up is because in 2023, if we all recall in the spring, it was a bit cool earlier on, right at that perfect herbicide timing. So we were oftentimes having to delay our herbicides to ensure we weren't causing any injury to the crop. And then as we delayed our herbicide timing, then came into the picture, we were trying to time our fungicides, our early fungicide applications, as well as our plant growth regulator applications. And then there's also concern about multi-tank mixes. And so with fall weed control, we can take that completely out of the equation and be able to more optimize our timing for our fungicide and our PGRs rather than trying to put 3 things in the tank and have them all applied at the wrong time. Some things in particular that we saw again this year, Canada fleabane, we know that it reduces yields by up to 27%, very significant yield impact if we leave that there. We also know that by managing it in the fall versus the spring, we can actually see a 10 to 15% yield advantage. So managing fleabane in the fall is so critical. And here again, just highlights a couple of options in terms of fall weed control or weed control for fleabane. We looked at Pixero in Infinity with Dr. Peter Sikkema at the University of Guelph. And what they found is that with that fall application, we tended to have a higher yield compared to a spring application. We're able to target much smaller rosettes in the fall and have much better control compared to the springtime when we're often trying to target much bigger Canada fleabane rosettes. Another weed that's great to control in the fall versus the spring are perennial weeds such as dandelions. With a weed like dandelion, what happens is the fall is that the weed starts to shift all of its resources to the roots to prepare itself for overwintering. And when we make a herbicide application in the fall, we can actually disrupt this allocation of resources, resulting in much better control compared to a spring application. And so you can see here, looking at a number of timings, with fall weed control, we're getting upwards of 80% control of our dandelion. compared to the springtime where we're getting 55 to 65% control. So there's quite a difference or a range with dandelions. The other piece of dandelions, so it's not just timing, but it's also the rate of glyphosate that we were using. And this was a challenge definitely in the fall of 2022. Herbicide prices were high. And so there was some, we decided to cut our rates a little bit, thinking that we would still optimize our control. But unfortunately, with a weed like dandelion, we really need to ensure that we are using that higher rate of 1.34 liters per acre, because that's what's required to control those large dandelions. So you may have, if you've tried this last fall and were disappointed with some of your control, follow up on your rate that was used, because in a number of instances, this was where we were running into some challenges, was that we were cutting back that rate. So make sure we're applying it at the right time, but also using the right weight for dandelion control. So those are two particularly challenging weed control issues in 2023, but we have a really great new resources led by the weeds team at OMAFRA, and that is the Crop Protection Hub. And so on the Crop Protection Hub, you can look for fall weed control or field crop weed control. You can select your crop species, you can select your weed species, and it'll generate a number of options for you, showing you the percent of control, the rates, and a whole bunch of crop protection information that you might need to know about application. So Crop Protection Hub, you can throw that into Google, and it'll help you generate some of these recommendations. The last piece that I wanted to touch on in terms of optimizing our yield potential is, once again, variety selection. The Ontario Cereal Crop Committee does excellent trials across the province and generates some pretty amazing. We are very, very lucky in Ontario to have such information like this. But look at the gocereals.ca website and make sure that you are understanding the strengths, but also the weaknesses of the variety that you're growing. For example, in 2023, we had areas that were particularly challenged with powdery mildew. So just being aware of things like your powdery mildew rating, if it's a highly susceptible variety, being aware of that and making sure that in the springtime, we're out scouting those fields that are a bit more susceptible compared to those that have good resistance. And again, things like lodging, understanding the lodging potential. If you are able to plant early this fall and you planted a high seeding rate and you've got a highly susceptible variety to lodging, again, it's just being aware of that. So when we're making our management decisions next spring, we're aware and can take that into consideration. So at the end of the day, if we want to optimize our yield potential in Ontario, it's all about stacking the layers. It's not just about planting date, and it's not just about seeding rate. It's taking all of the components and layering them together to optimize our potential. So we want to plant as early as we can. We know this year that's going to be a challenge, but fortunately, we still have excellent forecasts for growth and development this fall. We've got lots of grow and degree days coming at us in the next 2 weeks. We want to ensure that we're adjusting our seeding rates as we get into delayed planting. That'll help reduce any yield impact from a delayed planting. We want to make sure we're optimizing our fertility, ensuring we're putting that phosphorus down for promoting early root growth development. We want to make sure we're doing as much as we can in terms of fall weed control. We get better control of those perennial and annual or perennial weeds and winter annuals, such as dandelion, fleabane, shepherd's purse, chickweed. And we also just want to be aware of the variety that we're growing and the challenges that may be coming with that. And one thing I realized I didn't mention here is that also, as we're delaying our planting, make sure that we're using a seed treatment. If those varieties or those seeds are sitting in cooler soils a bit longer, a fungicide seed treatment can be really helpful in ensuring that we don't run into any issues with seedling diseases early on in the season. And with that, I wish everyone an excellent harvest and fall seeding. And thank you to all the partners in all of the projects, the University of Guelph Research on Campus, Grain Farmers of Ontario, and all those that are also involved in the Great Lakes Yen.
Joanne, I was kind of wondering, when you're talking about the canopy cover, and you mentioned 90% seemed to be like the target at flag leaf stage. I just wondered, are farmers able to measure that themselves to say, hey, how close am I to that ideal target of 90% of flag leaf? Is there any tools, or how can we estimate that?
Yeah, great question, Marty. And thank you for suggesting that. So there is a way for producers to actually measure that. So there's an app called Canopio. You can Google, just put Canopio into Google, or you can put it in your app store on your Android or your iPhone. And what Canopio allows you to do, you take a picture of your crop canopy 1 meter above the crop canopy. And Canopio will then generate a number for you, and that is your percent canopy closure. And what Emma did in her project, I showed that solar radiation capture. And what she did is with the Canopio app, she was able to show, or using statistics, she was able to demonstrate that the number we get in Canopio, so say it tells you it has a 85% canopy closure, that number is also the percent solar radiation that you are capturing. So she was able to highly show that the Canopio results and the solar radiation capture were very highly correlated. So if you get 85% canopy closure, you can be fairly confident that your crop is also receiving 85% solar radiation capture. So a great thing to do is if you've got different planted fields, like on different planting dates, in the spring or even this fall, go out and take those readings. So take a picture 1 meter above and track it along the season. And you can see the differences on your own farm and how your planting dates are impacting that canopy closure. So great question. Canopio, and it's available on Android, iPhone, and you can just use it on your computer as well.
Great, thanks. Also talking about canopy too, I got so many thoughts and ideas about, well, how about row width, or how about broadcasting? I know you mentioned about broadcasting, not as good. I don't like it because your depth control, and I like my roots in the ground so I don't get that spring heaving on winter wheat. But what's your thoughts as far as, you know, getting narrow rows to get that canopy closure quicker and maybe have that higher canopy at that critical time at flag leaf stage?
Yes, that's a great question. And so we in this particular study, we didn't measure canopy closure, but we do know that with going to narrower road widths, we do see an advantage. So there's a great trial that's actually been done at Michigan State, and they found in their study that by going from 15 inches to 7.5-inch rows, we get a 16.8 yield advantage. So we lose 16.8 bushels if we go from a 7.5 to a 15-inch row. Then when we go from a 7.5-inch row to a 5-inch row, they were seeing an 11 bushel per acre response. So there's a pretty significant advantage going from 15 inches to 7.5, but then again to 5-inch rows, we see a pretty significant advantage. And we're also seeing producers, as they go to those narrow row spacings, they're also reducing their seeding rate. So those plants have a bit more space within the row to express themselves. But we're seeing that earlier canopy closure, thanks to the narrow row spacing, we're able to maximize our solar radiation capture, and we're seeing those yield increases.
Excellent. Another question for you, Joanna. Yeah. Regarding desiccation of the soybeans, has there been any work to understand the germination? I'm just thinking there's probably a bunch of soybean seed producers out there, and what's the implications to that as a seed crop?
Great question. So as far as I know, in this particular study, we didn't look at that specifically. And as far as I know, there isn't necessarily an impact, but I would always recommend to follow the label with those applications and do a germ test if you are concerned with that. But again, like in this study, because we were seeing a negative impact on yield and test weight, we are not making recommendations to go and make these applications at this time.
Or also consult with the company you're growing the seed for if you have a contract to make sure you're following your contract obligations. Yeah.
Yes, thank you for adding that. Absolutely. Make sure that you are following those guidelines as well.
Oh, that's good.
Thank you so much, Joanna. That was a whole bunch of information packed into a very short amount of time. You covered planting date, fall outlook, conditions, phosphorus response, weed control, again, and a whole bunch of other learnings. Thank you so much for your time today, sharing that. I know for one that I will be taking some of that and using it for my winter wheat crop this year and going forward. So thanks for sharing that. Also, if you are looking for CEU credits for a CCA program, please email me, lferrier@gfo.ca, and I can make sure that you get the credits for watching this program here with Joanna. So Joanna, thanks again for taking the time to speak with us.
Thank
Thanks,
you very
Joanna.
much for having me.